You're listening to Apart from Himself, a story written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you'd like to read along to the stories that I upload to this blog, then you can find a link to that in the description of this video. He told Ruth he was feeling bad on Monday, better the next day, and worse the day after. Today he said he felt somewhere in the middle. He hoped he'd recover before evening. Their get-togethers were irregular, except for the time of day, always late. That was when he and his friends could talk, and he liked it that way. Evening set a natural limit on how much could be said, and when they reached that limit, they stopped. Nobody made excuses because nobody needed them. They didn't have anywhere to go except home. Given Richard's workload and profession as a lawyer, it was no wonder that he sometimes couldn't come. Morgan was amazed that Richard made time as often as he did, and he made his amazement known every time Richard apologized for not coming. One of the benefits of marrying Ruth was knowing she would be there at these parties of his. She had gone out for groceries 10 minutes ago. It was a habit of hers to connect errands. Oh, why not, she'd say to herself. I drove out here and I'll make it worth my while. What should take an hour could take far more. He never accompanied her unless she promised not to get sidetracked, as he called it. Ruth maintained that she got more done in one trip than he did. Some things, he said, could be put off until tomorrow instead of trying to do it all today. He thought of her face and could see it clearly. He never, and few people ever do, thought of his own face in the same way. That is, purposelessly, just to see it. He agonized over it as he looked at himself in the mirror, scouring first with his eyes and then with a sponge for imperfections. He hated most of all what he couldn't fix, how his features were drawn closely together on a space that therefore seemed too large for them. He did not in any case picture his face in his mind. Ruth, ever caring and lacking the minimum of guile needed to question him, asked Morgan how he felt every day, catalogued what he said, and could remember it better than he could. This was in vain, because all his answers were lies. He had never really felt one way or another. Feelings took hold of him and made him conform to their will. He'd offered himself up to them, as if saying, do with me what you want, and as if believing he had no real way to resist what came over him. Whether that be a passion, a frenzy, or what he had suffered. Under this very Sunday, a gaping absence of any energy whatsoever. He needed stimulation to keep it at bay, and he couldn't and shouldn't depend on Ruth to do that for him. People unlike him split this emptiness up into separate words and called it sadness, weariness, or boredom. Synonyms that, while different, derive their meaning from a similar place. The reason for their misunderstanding was that he didn't describe feelings to himself. It was a stupid idea that came from looking too closely and too literally at language. In his mind, saying he was this or that gave the feeling too much permanency, a relationship with him which it didn't deserve. For a time he might be in a bad mood, only for a time, and not forever. It would pass. However, this was a distinction he made only to himself. He talked about his feelings in the usual way, except once, when he had tried to tell Ruth about his theory. It was morning on a weekend. and they had both slept well, so he decided they were prepared for it as they'd ever be. His moods were black dogs that bit him. The phrase wasn't original, though it was the best he could do. He called happiness a sort of dog, too, which muddled his metaphor to the point that Ruth had him repeat it. He did. She listened carefully and said she understood, though she really didn't and had decided she didn't need to. He liked to talk and liked to think, and sometimes what came out was just meaningless. If he had pressed her on this point, he might have gotten her to admit that it was an untruth, or, and this was as far as she went in normal circumstances, a white lie. That one adjective served to make it not quite a lie, a euphemism which, unlike most of its kind, contained in itself what it hid. In the end, each of them was a little more confused than before. Although he felt there was something wrong with the way people talked, the way he stuck by out of convenience alone, it was a minor problem, one which he and she were both able to smooth over and then forget. There were other things Morgan told Ruth about, scenes from his life mostly. Those Ruth liked and knew what to do with. Yesterday, for example, while driving, he saw an airplane, drawing lines in the sky, with its condensation. Just lines, one long one, no letter. He went home with that in mind, and then looked for the plane again, hoping it would come their way. He took in the billboards, signs, and posters he saw about town, and gave his take on them at the earliest opportunity, though not while driving. One glance away from the road could mean an accident, so he gave the scenery a half glance. He was stupid, not reckless. I owe it to him to make this distinction, and to you too in a certain way. This is the most accurate light I can manage to throw on him. In some cases, recklessness might be better than the defects he actually had. He was partially aware of his own stupidity. Partially, not entirely, because then he couldn't have survived looking at himself in the mirror or having people hear him speak. Half a glance was all he needed to set himself off on a new train of thought. He saw a sign, and with a turn of phrase, reversed its meaning, or shunted it to the side into some neat place unforeseen by whoever wrote it. He played these tricks on inanimate objects, and on the sentences of unsuspecting people, who, once they heard the punchline, were amused most of the time. "I didn't know you could do that," one man had shouted in surprise. Not everyone who appreciated his talent was that loud. They knew they could all do it. Technically, and knew also that he was better at it than them, quicker on his feet, and with a mind that could reach further than theirs to arrive at the joke they'd almost thought of. A second difference Morgan remarked on was that while he welcomed an audience, he didn't rely on one. He told his jokes aloud if a friend was there, and if not, laughed alone. He liked to learn about where a word came from, and compared himself for this reason, and this reason only, to Richard, for whom being a lawyer meant working within a system established long before him, and which would remain long after. He took precedent into account, and though precedent was, he said, was a previous decision that mattered because it matter. Because it was accepted, Morgan had offered as an end to the thought. Exactly, Richard said. You began with a system of words and laws. You saw how they interacted and evolved, and if you were especially lucky, as Morgan could see, Richard hoped he would be every time he talked about it, you made some mark on it. Whether by repairing the old or creating the new. Richard knew more about law than Morgan knew about anything, and yet Morgan could keep joking because his games required him to know very little. Nothing more than the setup and punchline of a joke, not the whole history of a word, or the prevailing stance of a judge in question on this or that legal matter. They both dealt in thought, one professionally, one as an amateur, after working as a hotel receptionist. As Morgan saw it, his thoughts were little delights that harmed nobody, and made life more bearable. More people should aspire to do that before attempting grand designs. He had something to say as soon as he got home, even before he opened the door. His talk was as practical as his thinking got. His theories had the same purpose, though it took Morgan a bit to understand that this was possible. He used both his serious and unserious thought to amuse people, which was as useful an end as he could find for them. Interesting, a guest might say, dragging out the word. If they kept their attention and eyes on him, he went on. If not, he took it in stride and allowed someone else to take center stage. Ruth appreciated his gift, a conversationalist, she called him. He disputed this only in his head. To attack her for a compliment was the worst thing he could ever imagine himself doing. When they had guests over, he dressed up, as he did for every occasion. Morgan could make the neatest suit look casual without undoing his buttons or loosening his tie. It was how he moved in it, freely, unrestricted by the material itself and the equally stiff manners people dressed themselves with while wearing such clothes. He wore colored shirts regularly, and therefore easily. The usual thing was for people to reserve them for special events, and they looked the part. He cropped his hair, keeping it well above the collar of the wool jacket that winter was as of late forcing on him. Aside from the jacket, those were the kind of clothes, though not the exact uniform, he was expected to wear at work. And was happy to wear at home. It made no sense to Ruth. She supposed it didn't have to. Think what she might, Morgan stayed collared and smiled as he heard her open the door, glad to see her and to show her he wouldn't change. Not in a day, not in her life. You took your time, he said, as she came in. There was no nagging in his voice. He said this just to observe that it was so. Their friends weren't far behind her. He heard Richard ring his doorbell as Ruth unpacked the last of the groceries. Morgan and them sitting down at the table together quickly. He regaled them with jokes and stories, those from his own life and from the little reading he managed to do between everything else. He found people, famous or not, interesting, and he could talk about his friend in the same tone as he talked about figures whose whole lives were the subject of serious academic study. They all have had their depth, he proclaimed. You had only to look for it. As soon as he said this, he noticed that whatever mood he had been in, before it was gone. It had taken a long time in going, and he still couldn't give it a name, but it was gone, definitely gone. In history, he continued, he could find their equals in charm and wit and everything else that made them pleasant to be around. He read widely, and so they believed him readily. Nobody asked who exactly he was comparing to whom. His allusions were general. Richard had the air of an aristocrat, his wife that of, he paused, an aristocrat's wife. He could think of nothing funnier and played his failure off as a joke, simple repetition where they expected originality. Which of Richard's features fit that aristocratic mold? Richard left unsaid. By the low light of the candles and the darkness that was by now pressing against their windows, he could almost fool himself into believing that this was true. In this way, he was more romantic than Ruth. He saw in the plainness of his friends and his surroundings something that wasn't there. In other ways, Ruth outdid him. Every time he brought up swapping the candles for adjustable lamps, she found some excuse. It was such a small change, it wasn't worth it, she said. If it was such a small change, why did she fight it? He asked and got no answer worth repeating, then thought it over by himself and was no wiser. Their furniture was a mix of imitation mahogany and the real thing. Ruth decked the table with a cloth and placemats for everyone, so they'd have something between themselves and the hard wood. She favored dark colors for the candles, too, which meant that you could hardly see their wax if all the light you had to go on was on their wicks. When the candles weren't burning, they acted as something to fill out the table and give it character. Like the decorations Ruth set up based on what holiday was in season. With them, she was meticulous, and with their ornaments, too. The Christmas tree used to go in the garbage on the morning of December 30th. 5 Christmases ago, they had decided to buy an artificial tree and keep it in the basement in the off-season. It was summer now, and Ruth, thinking ahead, got up to shut the windows. Don't mind me, I won't be long. I'm making sure the flies don't get in, she said. They're here. Don't you see them? There's one, Morgan said. Morgan teased, pointing to the corners of the house where the light didn't reach. Then I'll stop the ones at the window and get the stowaways out after that. He watched her work and listened to their guests. It was a kind of work, being a host, the work he thoroughly enjoyed. Richard talked about his court cases, giving them the few specifics that the law allowed him to divulge, and insinuating a bit more. No names, though, and nothing that they could use to find his clients. He was bound by confidentiality and knew how short the rope around him was. He gave the table some idea of the matter at hand. A man had robbed a woman. The woman's valuables, her jewelry, her phone, and for good measure her purse, emptied of its contents so nobody'd be suspicious, were gone, as was the money the man had gotten for them from pawnshops. Richard dealt in small claims, which brought matters down to a level less intimidating to them than crimes you could call grand or measure by degrees. People without experience in law tried to understand his cases by whatever comparisons they found in their own lives. If it was petty theft, then they talked about the time their kid had stolen something from a store. None of them seemed to know what to do with this case. Well, it's difficult, someone began. The rest showed they agreed by not offering a solution. He should have to repay her, Ruth said. She looked around and saw nodding heads, listened and heard people say she was right. How easy it was to build a consensus. Everyone chimed in with their verdict, believing what she said was just common sense. How will the court know how much her things were worth, Richard said. I should have seen that coming. With a little effort, she very well could have. Whatever. She approached the case as what it was, a story, not her job. The story isn't over yet. You all jumped ahead to the ruling before you heard everything. I see your point about repaying damages. He gave her this undeserved credit because that was what you did for friends. The police asked around. They went through every pawn shop in town. Some of the shops kept receipts, some had gaps. That was nothing more questions couldn't solve. They found most of what she had lost, everything except the purse itself. Okay, so he repaid the woman for stealing and for what the police hadn't been able to reclaim. The judge fined him a rough estimate of what the purse should cost. Then came his prison sentence, the details of which Richard wasn't so sure about. Oh well. Morgan returned the favor with stories of the guests that came through his hotel's doors. Through the hotel's doors. It had a name and a history that his friends knew and which the hotel used. He liked to say he'd worked there for years and couldn't afford to stay a week. Famous people had passed through, most just for a night, and the hotel put up plaques to remind everyone of that. They had to. Their guests were people few would recognize if they didn't work at the hotel, and weren't fans of the celebrity in question. Morgan was the first to tell his friends about it. As much as the hotel boasted, it was hardly central to anyone's life. Not the anonymous rich, not powerful statesmen, not the musicians who had residencies there. What happened in one hotel could conceivably happen in the hotel next to it, not that Morgan cared. He worked where he worked and was proud of that. The hotel was a magnificent building. One look had convinced him of that, and every day he spent there furthered his conviction. It was painted in yellow and white, absurd colors that invited comparison to a lemon drop, colors which it somehow wore well anyway. Eventually the name became official and was totally separate from the word itself and the candy it represented, much like how the names of streets are said without anyone thinking where they came from. It took up half the street. At noon its shadow was as impressive as the building itself. The owner contended that the property taxes alone paid for more than its fair share. Add to that the tourism it generated, and the town would see he was doing them a favor. Above the hotel's entrance, covering the stairway and the path that led to the door, was a yellow dome the size of a small car. The door was as wide as two people and a little taller than Morgan, who appreciated not hitting his head on the ceiling for once. He made his irritation at things not built for him into a joke, ducking his head under doors and extending the motion to make it a small bow. The first time he'd entered the hotel, he'd done that out of habit and was pleased to find the frame fit him. Through the hotel door lay the lobby, and as soon as you saw that, you knew that the hotel put the space it paid for to good use. The floor was thickly carpeted and correspondingly soft. When the sun was out, the high windows made sure the lobby was well lit, and when the weather wouldn't cooperate, the chandeliers made up for it. Morgan was close with everyone in the hotel, physically at least, if not also on good terms. The separation between him and the kitchen was more severe than between him and the bellhop, understandably so, since the two of them saw each other every day. The kitchen was a place entirely unto itself. Morgan brought up luggage, if need be, and also helped everyone else in almost anything else, as long as it wouldn't keep him from his job for more than a minute. He recalled last Wednesday that 4 families had arrived at the same time, all with more luggage than they could carry. The bellhop grabbed what he could and stuck the overflow under his arm. If he could have carried it all at once, he would have. Half would have to do. Two of the families had rooms on the first floor. No need for an elevator then, the bellhop said to himself. Nobody said anything back. The guests exchanged impatient looks. They were each other's problem, the reason for the wait. They didn't see it that way. If this was the bellhop's best, he'd have to do better. Morgan confessed to the table that he felt pity for him. Poor kid, he said. The bellhop wasn't that young, though younger than him. He walked slowly, however, like an old man under all that weight. What strength he had was too far divided between what he had to carry. He was a quarter of the way up the first flight of stairs when Morgan took his luggage off him. The second clerk could take over for a minute. Morgan looked meaningfully over to the front desk as he said this. And how long did he need to bring up a suitcase or two anyway? The hotel had 2 elevators, only 6 floors for them to go to. And are these all your things? He pointed at what the bellhop had carried, which now lay in a heap at his feet. Yes, that was everything they had. He got an elevator, loaded it with their luggage, and sent it up to the first floor. They'd have to sort it out themselves. The 2 remaining families did as he told them and sent their things up to the second and third floor. The bellhop thanked them. Morgan told him not to. The trick to stopping people from getting too dependent on you, Morgan said, though none of his friends worked the sort of jobs where that was a possibility, was to sometimes not give them the help they needed. That hadn't come up yet. He was prepared for when it did. He made speeches that his friends didn't register as such, because he allowed them to respond. Be that as it may, a track's a track, no matter how many stops you make. They could say what they wanted. He wouldn't stop them, and they couldn't stop him. He'd give them his opinions, he said, piecemeal over the course of their dinner. Whether he talked or not, he'd finish in about the same time. He made such jokes in utmost privacy, and when he judged them good enough, he sent them out into the world for friends and strangers to hear. As long as he had the energy for giving, he was as generous with his thoughts as he was in his actions. Maybe if it were an earlier age, or, and this was harder for him to imagine, if he were a different sort of person, he'd have gathered all his wisdom in a book, and after getting it published, talk about it with his friends while the meager checks came in. The ambitions that followed him through life were ones he could easily satisfy. To put them all in one sentence, he wanted to be paid well for the time he worked, and to have some hours left to spend in good company. If he had wanted more, I think he could have gotten it. Started a union, changed jobs. He could have worked at his book in his off hours, making wisecracks and putting them to paper for posterity. And maybe he couldn't have. He was fortunate, I think, to be born as he was, with his sights set low and his mind not on what might be. The next day, Richard caught him off guard as he was finishing up the shopping Ruth had started. She'd forgotten a couple things. Given the circumstances, he was happy that Ruth had noticed they were out of eggs and butter, and that he could act the loving husband. He'd go for a drive and save her a second trip. It won't take me as long as it took you, he chided her gently in parting. Seeing Richard so unexpectedly, he felt one life suddenly thrust into another. It stopped him in his tracks. He'd wanted to shop amid people he didn't know and would not come to know. Now he couldn't. Richard, like Morgan, was there for the one reason any sensible person visits a grocery store, so he couldn't exactly be upset about it either. What are the chances I see you here? Richard exclaimed, then suddenly and uncomfortably aware of how loud he had been, quieted down to what seemed a whisper when compared to the previous shout. Richard went around the shopping cart which Morgan had placed between them. He moved his own cart aside to let a woman through. Morgan told him why he was there. Richard laughed. She's not usually forgetful, he said. No, not usually, Morgan agreed. It's only a couple things. And I needed to get it out of the house. I think I can forgive her. He began to decipher the scribbles, his and Ruth's, that made up their grocery list. She had written eggs in the same style for so long, her words more like abstract shapes than the letters they should be, that he could recognize it by how the loops and slants came together. The thought came to him that her handwriting, like his own, and like everyone else's, must have changed over time, and because this was undoubtedly true, he now wanted to compare the grocery list of years past to the one he held in his hand. How long's your grocery list? Morgan asked, to broach the subject. Haven't got one. No need, Richard replied. Got it up here, he said, tilting his head out. The two men had met in the vegetable aisle at the front of the store. They walked on together, stopping to park their carts by the aisles that were of interest to them. Morgan waited for Richard to get cereal, and then moved on. Richard did the same for Morgan in the meat aisle. They both had something to get in the dairy aisle. Richard his milk, and Morgan his butter. Eggs were nearby, and next to that was bread. Morgan bought fresh bread at the stand. Richard went for the prepackaged toast. Returning to his cart, Morgan saw that Richard was squatting to get a good look at the store's selection. Did you find it yet? No, Richard said. Of course not, he thought. Why would I keep looking? Could you get that for me? Morgan asked. The one in the red by your knee. Richard got up and gave it to him. They're out of what I wanted. He held up his replacement, the same brand Morgan bought. One last thing, Morgan said. I have to buy fly mesh for the windows. You don't know where I can find that, do you? Richard gave up looking before he'd started, preferring to ask an employee and have her make herself useful. She directed them to the gift cards. Take a left there. She saw Morgan's question in his eyes. It doesn't make any sense to me either. What can you do? He was eager to get home and tell Ruth about the mesh and Richard. He began to work out the conversation while driving. You'll never guess who I ran into at the grocery store. No, I won't. So out with it. Tell me, she'd say. Richard. Oh? By the time he'd arrived, he had rehearsed what he'd say and how she'd laugh at the jokes he had planned. That was, Apart from Himself, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to read along to the stories that I post in this blog, you can find a link to that in the description. Thanks, and until next time.